Hello Amanda, I'm here to present to you my group's presentation on Canuck Rock, how Canadian music has evolved from the 60s to the 90s and even to this day. So first off, some big name artists and groups that Canada has brought to the world. Of course, big one being Rush, started in 1968 in Montreal. April Wine, who started in 1969 in Halifax, Nova Scotia. Neil Young in 1969 from very close to here in Toronto. Tragically Hip in 1983 from Kingston. And lastly, Nickelback started in Alberta in 1995. So going back to the late 60s, early 70s, Rush came out with their debut album in 74, April Wine with theirs in 71, and Neil Young debuted his first album in 1969, even though he was touring and was in Buffalo Springfield, was his band with Stephen Stills, who I'll get to in a little bit, during the mid-late 60s. So with Rush, they've sold over 40 million albums and many sold out tours, and have their own Hollywood Walk of Fame star, and were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. As well, they achieved the highest civilian honor, getting the Officers of the Order of Canada. Another thing about them is, one fun fact, if you want to call it, is their first album is the only album with their original drummer. He had gotten sick and had to then cancel the tours, and he had then left the band. So, how did Rush, being Canadian, affect basically rock music worldwide? In an article that was published on Wednesday, April 28th, 2010, it was said that while Rush is ranked third for having the most consecutive gold or platinum studio albums behind only the Beatles and Rolling Stones, so they were pretty big with those names just ahead of them. And it basically showed that when you listen to music, especially the song Tom Sawyer, you can kind of, you can feel and understand what put them into that category. And basically they are an example of Canadian music breaking through into the more mainstream area, which is, of course, is America. With April Wine, they had released more than 20 albums and also had about 20 members throughout their career, coming and going, since 1971. They're in the Canadian Music Hall of Fame and had a major impact on North American music with having 11 nominations at the Junos. Of course, as previously said, they had formed in 69, but had broken apart in 84, the release of Animal Grace. But after requests and fans wanting them back together, they did come together in 1992. And they were welcomed with huge support from fans in Canada and as well the States. And even now they have tours that people really want to be attending. So as for Neil Young, I became a fan of actually when he sang It's a Dream on SNL. I do love his other songs such as Rockin' the Free World and Fucking Up. Of course, our Canadian-born star started his career out west with several bands and going solo. Of course, I mentioned the Buffalo Springfield. It was in 1968 that Crosby, Stills, and Nash had picked up Young in 1969, and they had formed. But what we have here, he moved to California and was involved with other artists, and then became a solo act, as I was saying. His songwriting influenced many other artists and was even called the godfather of grunge. With 50 years in the music industry and being one of the most influential guitarists / songwriters of his time. And as well, a couple other things. He received the Order of Manitoba in 2006 and was made an officer of the Order of Canada in 2009. as well as many Grammy wins, many Juno wins, and being put into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And was ranked 34th, the 34th greatest rock and roll star by Rolling Stone magazine. And it shows a lot through his distinctive guitar sound and even his lyrics, which are come from a very deep personal place of his. He as well is an activist supporting the environment and children's disabilities. Not mine, but I'm sure a lot of the people's out there. He's founder of R&D and the School for the Epilepsy and Cerebral Palsy. He is even involved in many fundraising events, such as Live Aid, with many other popular artists. So moving on to the late 80s to 2000s, when it comes to Canadian rock, we have the Tragically Hip. As I said before, started in 1983 in Kingston, with their first album debuting in 1989. And of course, the big love-or-hate group Nickelback, formed in 95, with their first album debuting in 96. Now with the Tragically Hip, they have 13 albums, and 16 of their 54 singles have had Juno Awards come to them. After the passing, though, of their lead singer, Gord Downie, in 2017, my mistake. Even though they weren't able to break into the US, they were a popular band here in Canada. Basically, Gord Downie did a lot. I know there's a lot of the music when it comes to Tragically Hip. Of course, as well, there is his work he did with Indigenous people and the environment. So he created a big name, not just in music, but even just the words spreading throughout. But anyways, so with his, as I hear, his lyrics did touch on Canadian issues that normally not addressed by their bands, such as the two I mentioned. Even though they did not go mainstream in the US, they had a song reach number 16 on the Billboard mainstream rock tracks. So they still were kind of breaking out there a little bit, but fortunately did not make it as far as other bands, but still were huge in our country. When he had the final concert, millions were watching that, so it really shows how big they were here. Nickelback were the 11th best-selling musical act of all time and the second best-selling foreign group in the US, behind only the Beatles. The group debuted in 95, as previously aforementioned, and sold 50 million albums. If I was wondering, they're not even close to beating the Beatles record. So, we're all wondering, of course, how Nickelback affected music worldwide, coming from our country, which I know is not as mainstream as the States or the UK. And a lot of bands are now coming in all kinds of different genres. But an article published in late 2001, it stated, and I quote, "Never heard of Nickelback? You obviously haven't tuned in to a rock radio station for the past 2 months. For the band's smash hit power ballad, How You Remind Me, has been riding roughshod over the competition. The hard-rocking hit ripped into rotation in August, making it the first Canadian single to enter the US rock radio top 10 its first week of release since the Guess Who's American Woman back in 1970. It's held on tight ever since." So yes, the song How You Remind Me is a song that helped Nickelback break into the US market. And I actually do remember, I was a big fan of that song when I was a kid. It's really the only song I really like from them. But I remember that it held a 13-week record as #1 on the Billboard charts until it was taken down by a close band of mine, Linkin Park, with their song In the End. So they were holding strong back then, at least. Yeah, I know they're still going now, but I'm not going to be too up to date on what they're doing. But I know they're still going. So yes, in conclusion, sound waves have flown our flag for these 4 decades, but still have not even come to a halt there. Thanks to these artists who even to this day continue their legacy, Canada has been a nation and a home to some of the greatest music in rock. And it does show. When I was a kid growing up, I had my Sum 41, which is Canadian, so if it wasn't for these bands, I may not have had them. And of course for yourself, I know in class you talked a lot about the bands and the style of music and everything, your genres of music and the style you had growing up. I'm sure there's a lot of bands that affected you, and if it wasn't for all these bands, we probably wouldn't have what we have today. And we wouldn't have ourselves breaking out into more of the mainstream world. It would just be America and the UK taking over, which have a lot of great artists, but of course every country wants to show what they have. Jess, thank you for listening to our presentation. Have a good night.